Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Ottoman Imperial Harem. And trust me, it's nothing like what you've seen in those steamy historical dramas where everyone's constantly lounging around eating grapes and gossiping. So before you get comfortable with your romanticized notions, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into one of history's most misunderstood institutions. Let's start with the biggest misconception about the Ottoman harem. Picture this. You probably think it was some kind of ancient Turkish version of a luxury spa resort, where beautiful women spent their days getting pampered, practicing seductive dances, and competing for the Sultan's attention like contestants on The Bachelor, Constantinople edition. In reality, the Imperial Harem was essentially a highly structured government institution that functioned more like a cross between a boarding school, a corporate headquarters, and a maximum security prison, with better interior decorating. This wasn't some hedonistic paradise where women draped themselves in silk and waited around to catch the Sultan's eye. It was a complex bureaucratic machine with its own hierarchy, politics, education system, and power structure that could make modern corporate culture look like child's play. Think of it less like a romantic fantasy and more like if Hogwarts had been run by the CIA, but with more embroidery and significantly higher stakes. The women weren't lounging around eating Turkish delight. They were navigating a system so cutthroat that one wrong move could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. And here's the kicker. Most of the women in the harem never even saw the Sultan, let alone shared his bed. They were more likely to spend their entire lives serving other women in the hierarchy, learning skills, and following rules so complex they'd make tax law look straightforward. The 16th century Ottoman Empire wasn't your typical medieval kingdom where some guy with a crown just did whatever he wanted. It was a sophisticated, multi-ethnic, multi-religious superpower that stretched from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iran. Basically, if the Roman Empire had been run by really organized administrators with better fashion sense, the Sultan wasn't just sitting around in robes making arbitrary decisions. He was managing an empire so complex that it required an entire governmental apparatus just to keep track of who owed what to whom. Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, wasn't some exotic oriental city from a fairy tale. It was the New York city of its day, a bustling, cosmopolitan metropolis where Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenian merchants, Jewish bankers, and Muslim administrators all lived and worked together in a system that was remarkably tolerant for its time. The Topkapi Palace, where the harem was located, wasn't just a pretty building where the Sultan lived. It was the administrative center of a government that employed thousands of people and controlled trade routes that connected Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Ottoman court controlled everything from tax collection in remote Balkan villages to the pilgrimage routes to Mecca, from the spice trade with India to diplomatic relations with Venice. If you thought running a modern government was complicated, imagine doing it without computers, telephones, or even reliable mail service, while simultaneously managing an empire where your subjects spoke dozens of different languages and followed different religions. And here's where it gets interesting. The harem wasn't some side project or royal indulgence. It was an integral part of this governmental system, producing future rulers, managing vast wealth, and wielding political influence that extended far beyond the palace walls. Enter Roxelana, whose real name was Alexandra Lisowska, a woman who would have made Machiavelli himself take notes. She started as what the Ottomans called a slave girl, though this wasn't slavery as we typically understand it, but more like an extremely exclusive internship program with no way to quit and potentially fatal performance reviews. Roxelana was probably captured during Ottoman raids in what's now Ukraine, brought to the imperial court as a teenager, and entered a system designed to turn young women into the most educated, sophisticated, and politically savvy individuals in the empire. But here's where Roxelana broke every rule in the book. She didn't just survive the harem system, she conquered it. In a world where concubines were supposed to gracefully retire after producing a male heir, Roxelana convinced Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the guy they called the greatest Ottoman ruler, to not only free her but to actually marry her. This was like convincing the Pope to give up Catholicism and become a professional wrestler. It simply wasn't done. The consequences were seismic. By marrying Roxelana, Suleiman essentially said, "You know what? I'm going to tear up centuries of tradition because this woman is just that remarkable." She became the first former slave to become a legal wife of a reigning sultan, which meant her children had a legitimate claim to the throne, not just the informal succession rights that came with being imperial offspring. But wait, it gets better. Roxelana didn't just sit back and enjoy her new status. She essentially became co-ruler of the empire. She corresponded with foreign leaders, managed vast construction projects, established charitable foundations, and influenced state policy. European ambassadors wrote home about this mysterious woman who seemed to have the Sultan completely under her spell, which tells us less about her supposed feminine wiles and more about her political genius. And if you think that's impressive, wait until you hear about what happened when other women in the harem decided they weren't going to let some Ukrainian upstart reorganize their entire world order. This wasn't just about romantic intrigue or court gossip. When Roxelana married Suleiman, she fundamentally altered the power structure of one of the world's most important empires. The traditional system had been designed to prevent exactly what she accomplished: the concentration of influence in the hands of one woman who could potentially manipulate imperial succession for her own family's benefit. The other women in the harem, the court officials, the janissaries, the elite military corps, and even foreign governments all had to recalculate their strategies. If a former slave could become empress, what other traditions might be up for grabs? If the Sultan could be influenced by personal relationships, how might that change foreign policy, military campaigns, or economic decisions? The stakes extended far beyond the palace walls. The Ottoman Empire's enemies, primarily the Habsburg monarchy and various European powers, suddenly realized they might need to factor in the influence of women they'd never even heard of. When planning their diplomatic and military strategies, Venetian merchants wondered if their trade agreements might now depend on currying favor with the Sultan's wife. Persian diplomats had to consider whether their negotiations might be influenced by someone who had never appeared in their intelligence reports. Meanwhile, within the harem itself, hundreds of women who had spent years learning the traditional rules of advancement suddenly found themselves in a game where the rulebook had been thrown out the window. Some adapted, some plotted, and some simply tried to survive in a system that was evolving faster than anyone could predict. But Roxelana's transformation from Ukrainian peasant girl to Ottoman empress was just the beginning of one of history's most fascinating political and social experiments. The institution she had helped to reshape would go on to produce some of the most powerful women in world history, create a shadow government that sometimes wielded more real influence than the official one, and develop a culture so complex and sophisticated that it would take European observers centuries to even begin to understand what they were looking at. What happened next would make Roxelana's story look like the opening act of a much larger drama, one involving poisonings, palace coups, international espionage, and political maneuvering that would make a modern-day soap opera look like a documentary about library science. The woman who had broken the mold was about to discover that sometimes, when you change the rules of the game changes you right back. So now we need to talk about what life was actually like inside the harem. And I'm going to destroy another romantic myth right off the bat. Unlike the popular image of women lounging around in gossamer veils, waiting to be summoned by the Sultan, the Imperial Harem operated more like a combination of West Point Military Academy and Harvard Business School, if both institutions had been designed by someone with a serious obsession with interior decorating and a zero-tolerance policy for career changes. The harem wasn't a place where women were kept for the Sultan's pleasure. It was an institution that produced the most educated women in the Ottoman Empire. These women learned to read and write in multiple languages: Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and often the languages of their birth countries. They studied poetry, music, mathematics, theology, politics, and statcraft. By the time a woman reached a senior position in the harem hierarchy, she was probably more qualified to run a government ministry than most of the men who actually held those positions. The daily routine would have made a modern productivity guru weep with joy. Women woke before dawn for prayers, spent hours in educational instruction, practiced various arts and crafts, managed complex household economies, and participated in a social hierarchy so intricate that it required its own version of Robert's Rules of Order, just to figure out who got to speak first at dinner. But here's the thing that would drive you absolutely insane if you were suddenly transported there. Privacy, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. Every moment of your day was scheduled, supervised, and evaluated. Want to take a quiet walk alone? Not happening. Feel like sleeping in because you stayed up late reading? Dream on. Need some time to process your emotions after receiving bad news from home? Too bad. You've got embroidery class in 10 minutes. And the instructor is one of those people who takes needlework very, very seriously. Take the case of Gulbahar Hatton, who provides us with a perfect example of how quickly things could go. From living the dream to living the nightmare in the harem world. Gulbahar was the mother of Prince Selim, who everyone assumed would be the next sultan because, well, he was the oldest son, and that's usually how these things worked. For years, she enjoyed the elevated status that came with being the mother of the heir apparent, which meant better apartments, more servants, fancier clothes, and the kind of social respect that came with potentially being the future queen mother. But then Roxelana showed up and married the Sultan, which meant her sons suddenly became legitimate heirs instead of just acknowledged ones. Overnight, Gulbahar went from being the woman everyone sucked up to because they assumed her son would be their future boss, to being the woman everyone avoided because backing the wrong potential heir in Ottoman succession politics was a career-limiting move. And by career-limiting, I mean potentially life-limiting. The competition between these two women became the stuff of legend, and not the fun kind of legend where everyone learns valuable lessons about friendship. We're talking about a rivalry so intense that it allegedly involved everything from poisoning, attempts to orchestrated accidents, to complex spy networks within the harem itself. One contemporary chronicler claimed that Gulbahar once tried to have Roxelana's favorite servant accidentally fall down a well, while Roxelana supposedly arranged for Gulbahar's meals to be prepared by cooks who had mysteriously developed a tendency to oversalt everything to the point of inedibility. Another woman, Mahidevran Sultan, provides an even more dramatic example of how the harem's competitive atmosphere could destroy lives. She had been Suleiman's favorite before Roxelana arrived, and her son Mustafa was widely considered the most capable potential heir. But when Roxelana convinced the Sultan that Mustafa was plotting against him, whether this was true or just masterful political manipulation is still debated by historians. Suleiman had his own son executed. Mahidevran spent the rest of her life in exile, went slightly mad from grief, and allegedly spent her final years writing poetry about how much she hated Ukrainian women in general, and Roxelana in particular, the psychological toll of living in This environment was enormous. These women were essentially professional competitors in a game where the stakes were literally life and death. But they also had to maintain the facade of being a harmonious imperial family. Imagine if the Hunger Games had been set in a luxury resort, where everyone had to pretend they were having a lovely time right up until the moment they tried to eliminate each other. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in Ottoman court life was ever simple. Life was ever simple. The harem system was designed with multiple layers of protection and contradiction that were supposed to prevent exactly the kind of cutthroat competition that ended up defining it. The traditional system had been based on the idea that no one woman should ever gain too much influence, which is why the Sultan wasn't supposed to marry his concubines, and why the mothers of princes were typically sent away to govern provinces. Once their sons came of age, the complicating factors were numerous and often absurd. For example, there were strict rules about everything from how many pieces of jewelry a woman could wear, based on her rank, to which bathroom she was allowed to use. Yes, they had a hierarchical bathroom system. But these rules were constantly being bent, broken, or reinterpreted depending on who had political influence at any given moment. One woman might be punished for wearing the wrong color silk to dinner, while another might get away with essentially running a small business empire from her quarters, because she happened to be friends with someone who was friends with someone who had the Sultan's ear. The strangest contradiction was that while the harem was supposedly about the Sultan's romantic life, most of the women never even met him. The majority spent their entire careers serving other women, managing the institution's complex economy, or working in the palace administration. It was entirely possible to live in the imperial harem for decades and have your only interaction with the Sultan be glimpsing him from a distance during religious ceremonies. Modern feminists have struggled with how to interpret the harem system, because it simultaneously oppressed women by limiting their freedom and empowered them by providing education, political influence, and economic opportunities that were unavailable to most women anywhere else in the world at that time. These women were technically slaves, but some of them wielded more real political power than most European queens. They couldn't leave the palace freely, but they could influence decisions that affected millions of people across 3 continents. The result was a system that produced some of the most politically sophisticated women in world history, but also some of the most psychologically damaged. The successful ones became master manipulators who could navigate Byzantine court politics with the skill of seasoned diplomats. The unsuccessful ones often ended up exiled, imprisoned, or worse, and sometimes the only difference between success and failure was being in the right place at the right time when the Sultan happened to be in a good mood. The institutional reactions were equally complex. The traditional Ottoman establishment, the viziers, the religious authorities, the military commanders, found themselves dealing with a new power center that they didn't fully understand and couldn't directly control. Some tried to ally themselves with influential harem women. Others attempted to limit their influence, and a few simply gave up and decided to focus on other aspects of imperial administration that seemed more predictable. The international consequences were even more interesting. European diplomats began hiring specialists who could analyze harem politics and predict how personal relationships might affect state policy. The Venetians, who were always ahead of the curve when it came to intelligence gathering, reportedly maintained a network of informants who tracked the rise and fall of different harem factions and adjusted their diplomatic strategies accordingly. Though, long-term implications transformed the nature of Ottoman imperial succession and created what historians now call the Sultanate of Women, a period when the empire was effectively ruled by a series of remarkable female leaders who held power behind the scenes while their sons or grandsons served as nominal rulers. This wasn't planned. It evolved organically as the harem system adapted to the political realities created by women like Roxelana, who had proven that the harem system adapted to the political realities created by women like Roxelana, who had proven that the harem system traditional rules could be successfully challenged. Meanwhile, the next generation of harem women was watching all of this unfold and taking notes. They had seen what happened when someone successfully broke the old rules. And they had also seen what happened to those who backed the wrong horses in the succession sweepstakes. What they learned from observing Roxelana's triumph and her rivals' defeats would shape their own strategies and, ultimately, transform the harem from an institution designed to limit female power into one that concentrated it in ways that would have horrified the system's original architects. The stage was now set for an even more dramatic transformation, one that would make Roxelana's story look like a practice round for the main event. If Roxelana's era was the dramatic overthrow of traditional harem politics, then what came next was the systematic institutionalization of female power in ways that would have made the founding fathers of America nervous about their own wives. The next generation of harem women didn't just break the rules. They rewrote them entirely and then created enforcement mechanisms that would have impressed a modern corporate compliance department. What we're talking about here is the emergence of what historians call the valid Sultan system. Essentially, the Queen Mother position becoming so powerful that it functioned as a shadow sultanate. These women weren't content to influence their sons from behind the scenes. They created formal governmental roles for themselves, complete with official correspondence, diplomatic authority, and administrative responsibilities that rivaled those of the Grand Vizier himself. This became important because the Ottoman Empire was entering a period of increasing complexity and external pressure. The traditional male-dominated governmental system was showing signs of strain as the empire expanded beyond what could be effectively managed by classical methods. Into this administrative gap stepped a group of women who had been trained from childhood in the most sophisticated political environment in the world, had decades of experience managing complex bureaucracies, and had absolutely no patience for the kind of inefficiency that came from putting unqualified men in charge of important decisions, just because they happened to be born male. The result was a governmental system so unique that European observers literally didn't have vocabulary to describe what they were seeing. Imagine trying to explain to someone in 1600 that one of the world's most powerful empires was being co-ruled by women who technically didn't hold official positions, but who were making decisions about everything from military campaigns to tax policy. It would have sounded like a fairy tale, except fairy tales usually made more sense. Consider the remarkable career of Nurban of Sultan, who turned the art of long-term strategic thinking into something approaching performance art. Born Cecilia Venier Baffo in Venice. Yes, she was Italian. Because the Ottoman harem was nothing if not internationally diverse. She was captured by Ottoman corsairs as a young woman and entered the harem system during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. But here's where Nurbanu's story gets fascinating. Instead of trying to immediately climb the harem hierarchy through the traditional route of catching the Sultan's attention, she played a 40-year-long game that would have impressed a chess grandmaster. She quietly positioned herself as an advisor and mentor to other women, built a network of allies throughout the palace administration, and carefully studied the mistakes that had destroyed women like Mahidevran and Gulbahar. When her son, Murad, became Sultan, Nurbanu didn't just become Queen Mother. She essentially became co-emperor. She maintained her own diplomatic correspondence with European leaders, including a remarkable series of letters with Catherine de' Medici of France, in which they discussed everything from trade agreements to military strategy. The Venetian ambassador reported that conducting business with the Ottoman Empire increasingly meant conducting business with Nurbanu, who had better intelligence networks than most European governments and a more sophisticated understanding of international economics than many professional diplomats. But the really impressive part was how she managed the transition of power to the next generation. When Murad died and her grandson Mehmed became Sultan, Nur Banu arranged for her daughter-in-law, Safi Sultan, to assume the valid Sultan role while she remained as a kind of emeritus advisor. This created a system of overlapping female authority that ensured institutional continuity even during periods of political instability. The drama reached its peak during what became known as the Incident of the Golden Goblets, which sounds like the title of a Nancy Drew mystery, but was actually a serious international crisis. Nur Banu had been conducting secret negotiations with Venetian merchants about copper trading rights, which conflicted with agreements the official Ottoman government had made with French traders. When the French ambassador discovered what was happening, he complained to the Sultan, who had to admit that he wasn't entirely sure what his mother had promised to whom. The resolution was both hilarious and revealing. They held a formal diplomatic conference in which the valid Sultan sat behind a curtain and negotiated directly with foreign ambassadors, while the Sultan and his ministers listened and took notes. The final agreement was signed by both the Sultan and his mother, creating what was possibly the world's first official mother-son co-regency in a major empire. This wasn't isolated to just one remarkable woman or one unusual situation. What we see throughout the late 16th and early 17th centuries is the systematic development of parallel governmental structures that allowed the harem to function as an alternative power center within the Ottoman state. Women who had been trained to manage the complex internal politics of the palace found themselves naturally suited to managing the complex external politics of the empire. The pattern that emerged was remarkably consistent. A new sultan would ascend to the throne, his mother would assume the role of valid sultan, and within a few years she would have established her own networks of communication with provincial governors, foreign ambassadors, religious authorities, and military commanders. These networks often provided more reliable information and more effective policy implementation than the official governmental channels. Why did this pattern exist? The answer lies in the unique training and perspective that harem women brought to governance. Unlike male officials who had typically specialized in either military, administrative, or religious careers, these women had been educated in all aspects of statecraft from childhood. They understood economics because they had managed household budgets for institutions housing thousands of people. They understood diplomacy because they had survived decades of intricate palace politics. They understood military strategy because they had observed how personal conflicts could escalate into institutional crises. European observers noted that Ottoman policy during this period became notably more sophisticated and nuanced, with greater attention to long-term consequences and more skillful management of competing interests. What they were seeing was the effect of bringing a different kind of intelligence and experience to bear on imperial governance. Women who had been trained to think in terms of relationships, networks, and sustainable systems rather than just hierarchical command structures. The comparison to other time periods is striking. During the classical period of Ottoman expansion, policy was typically made by military commanders who thought in terms of conquest and territorial control. During the later period of decline, it was dominated by religious conservatives who prioritized traditional authority structures. But during the Sultanate of Women period, policy was influenced by administrators who thought in terms of complex systems management. And the results show in the empire's ability to adapt to changing international circumstances while maintaining internal stability. The effects were transformative in ways that extended far beyond the immediate political sphere. Who benefited? Certainly, the women who gained unprecedented access to political power. but also the empire as a whole, which gained access to a pool of talent that had previously been underutilized. Provincial administration became more efficient because governors knew they were accountable not just to the Sultan, but to his mother, who often had better information about local conditions than the central government. International trade flourished because harem women, many of whom came from merchant families in various parts of Europe and Asia, understood commercial networks in ways that career military officers did not. The empire's diplomatic relationships became more stable because foreign governments learned they could negotiate long-term agreements with women who were likely to remain in power for decades, rather than with male officials whose positions might change with each administrative reshuffling. Who suffered? Primarily, the traditional male establishment, which found its monopoly on political influence, challenged by a group of women who were often better educated, more experienced, and more politically sophisticated than they were. The Janissaries, in particular, struggled to adapt to a system where their traditional role as kingmakers was complicated by the presence of queen mothers who had their own sources of military support and their own ideas about imperial policy. The unintended consequences were sometimes spectacular. The most successful harem women became so powerful that they occasionally found themselves in conflict with their own sons, leading to some truly awkward family dynamics. Imagine having to ground your mother because she's conducting unauthorized diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers, but she controls the palace budget and has better relationships with your military commanders than you do. How this shaped future developments was profound. The Ottoman Empire's ability to survive and adapt during the 17th and early 18th centuries, a period when many other great empires were declining or fragmenting, can be directly attributed to the innovative governmental structures developed during the Sultanate of Women period. The empire learned to function as a complex, multi-centered system rather than a simple autocracy, which made it more resilient when facing external challenges. The modern parallels are fascinating and somewhat uncomfortable. We're essentially looking at a system where women gained political power not through formal democratic processes, but through their superior ability to manage complex institutions and navigate intricate political relationships. Sound familiar? Yet, even as the valid Sultan system was reaching its peak of influence and effectiveness, the seeds of its own transformation were already being planted. The very success of women like Nurbanu Sultan was creating new challenges and opportunities that would test the limits of what the harem system could achieve. The next generation of harem women would face not just the traditional challenges of palace politics, but the additional burden of living up to the achievements of their predecessors while dealing with an empire that was becoming increasingly difficult to govern through any system. No matter how sophisticated, what happened next would determine whether the Sultanate of Women represented a permanent evolution in Ottoman governance or just a temporary historical aberration. And the answer would depend on whether the next generation of harem women could prove themselves even more remarkable than the women who had come before them. By 1617, the Ottoman Empire was facing what modern management consultants would call a perfect storm of institutional dysfunction. And the harem system was about to be tested in ways that would make a corporate merger look like a friendly neighborhood potluck. The problem wasn't just political. It was generational, cultural, and deeply personal all at the same time. Sultan Ahmed I had died young, leaving behind a succession crisis that would have given constitutional lawyers nightmares. His brother, Mustafa, was next in line, but he was generally considered to be, let's say, not entirely mentally stable. Ahmed's son, Osman, was technically too young to rule effectively, but he was obviously more competent than his uncle. Meanwhile, the Queen Mother, Kaiksem Sultan, had spent years building a power base that assumed her son would have a long reign, and she wasn't about to let a premature death ruin 20 years of careful political planning. The traditional Ottoman system for handling this kind of situation was straightforward. The oldest male heir became Sultan, and everyone else adapted accordingly. But by 1617, the harem women had become so integrated into the governmental system that a change in leadership wasn't just a dynastic transition. It was a potential reorganization of the entire imperial administration. The stakes involved weren't just who would wear the fancy hat and live in the biggest room. They were about who would control trade routes that connected 3 continents, diplomatic relationships with major European powers, and military forces that could determine the balance of power from Vienna to Baghdad. The key players involved read like a cast list for a political thriller. Kexem Sultan, the Queen Mother, was at the height of her power and influence, with networks that extended from the Janissary courts to the Ottoman bureaucracy to foreign merchant communities. Safi Sultan, the former Queen Mother, was technically retired but still commanded considerable loyalty and had her own ideas about how the succession should be handled. The various palace factions, military, religious, administrative, and economic, all had their own preferred outcomes and their own reasons for supporting or opposing different candidates. What happened next became known as the Incident of the Iron Cage, though it really should have been called the week when everyone in the Ottoman Empire lost their minds simultaneously. The crisis began when Sultan Mustafa, during one of his more lucid moments, announced that he was going to solve the empire's problems by eliminating all the women who had been interfering with traditional masculine governance. This was roughly equivalent to announcing that he planned to improve the efficiency of a modern corporation by firing everyone who knew how to use computers. The immediate reaction was panic, but not the kind of panic you might expect. The harem. Women didn't flee or beg for mercy. They organized. Within hours, Kexem Sultan had activated what can only be described as a shadow government apparatus that she had been building for decades. She sent coded messages to provincial governors, arranged for the Ottoman treasury to be secured by loyal guards, and somehow managed to get word to the Janissary commanders that their pay might be delayed if certain personnel changes were implemented. Meanwhile, Safi Sultan, who had been quietly enjoying her retirement, suddenly emerged from her private apartments with a list of every political favor she had ever granted and every piece of compromising information she had ever acquired. The scene that followed was like watching a master chess player reveal that what everyone thought was a friendly game had actually been a carefully orchestrated strategy session that had been going on for 30 years. The confrontation itself took place in the Hall of the Divan, the formal throne room where the Sultan traditionally held court. Mustafa, surrounded by his male advisors, faced off against what was essentially a committee of women who had more institutional knowledge than everyone else in the room combined. The dialogue, as recorded by palace chroniclers, was both terrifying and absurd. Mustafa, attempting to assert traditional authority. "I am the Sultan. I will not be told how to govern by women." Kexem Sultan, with the patience of someone explaining basic arithmetic to a slow child. "Your Majesty, with respect, you have been Sultan for 6 months. I have been managing imperial affairs for 20 years. Perhaps we could discuss which of us has more experience with the practical aspects of governance." The turning point came when Mustafa demanded to see the imperial treasury, apparently thinking he could use financial pressure to force compliance. Kexem Sultan calmly informed him that the treasury keys were in her possession, along with the seals needed to authorize payments to the military. She then proceeded to read aloud from what was essentially a receipt book, detailing every major expenditure of the past 5 years and demonstrating that she had a better understanding of the empire's financial situation than anyone else in the room. The climax was both dramatic and slightly ridiculous. Mustafa, realizing that he had been effectively outmaneuvered by his own mother-in-law, declared that he would rather die than be ruled by women. Kexem Sultan, without missing a beat, replied that this could be arranged, but wouldn't it be more practical for everyone involved if he simply agreed to focus on the ceremonial aspects of being Sultan while leaving the actual governance to people who had demonstrated competence in that area. The response was immediate and far-reaching. The Janissaries, who had been watching this confrontation with the fascination of spectators at a particularly dramatic sporting event, announced that they would support whoever could guarantee their regular pay, which, given the state of the imperial finances, was clearly not going to be Mustafa acting alone. The religious authorities, who might have been expected to support traditional male authority, found themselves in the awkward position of having to choose between Islamic law and practical governance. After some hasty consultation, they announced that while they preferred male leadership in principle, they also believed that competent administration was a religious duty, and competence seemed to be in short supply among the available male candidates. The immediate consequences were both revolutionary and absurd. Mustafa remained Sultan in name, but Qasim Sultan became what was essentially a co-ruler with veto power over major decisions. The arrangement was formalized through a series of documents that carefully avoided using terms like partnership or shared authority while creating exactly that kind of system. The political fallout was spectacular. European ambassadors reported back to their governments that the Ottoman Empire appeared to be ruled by a committee of women who were more politically sophisticated than most European cabinets. The Venetian ambassador wrote a particularly detailed report describing how Ottoman policymaking had become so efficient that it was making other governments look incompetent by comparison. The ironic outcomes were numerous and entertaining. Mustafa, relieved of the burden of actually making decisions, turned out to be quite good at the ceremonial aspects of being Sultan. He developed a talent for public appearances and religious ceremonies that helped maintain the fiction of traditional male authority, while the real governance was handled by people who actually knew what they were doing. Meanwhile, the harem system had evolved into something that was unprecedented in world history. A functioning governmental partnership between nominal male authority and actual female competence. It was a system that shouldn't have worked according to any political theory available at the time, but it did work, and it worked well enough that the Ottoman Empire continued to function as a major power for another century. This incident wasn't just about resolving a succession crisis or managing a family dispute. What it revealed was that the Ottoman Empire had stumbled into a form of government that was arguably more sophisticated and effective than any other system available in the early modern world. The traditional European model of absolute monarchy was limited by the fact that it depended entirely on the competence of whoever happened to inherit the throne. The Ottoman system, as it had evolved by 1617, had developed mechanisms for ensuring that actual governance was handled by people who had proven their competence through decades of practical experience. What this revealed about the system was that it had become remarkably adaptable. Instead of being destroyed by a crisis that would have paralyzed most other governments, the Ottoman administration had essentially performed an institutional evolution. In real time, the harem women hadn't just seized power. They had demonstrated that they were better qualified to exercise that power than the people who were supposed to have it, by right of birth and gender. The long-term effects would reshape not just Ottoman governance, but the very concept of political authority in the Islamic world. For the first time in Islamic history, female political leadership had been formally acknowledged and institutionalized in a major empire. This wasn't a temporary emergency measure or a behind-the-scenes influence. It was an official recognition that competence mattered more than gender when it came to running a government. Why historians still debate this event is because it challenges every assumption about how traditional societies were supposed to work. According to conventional wisdom, a 17th century Islamic empire should not have been able to peacefully transition to a system of shared male-female governance. The fact that it happened and that it worked suggests that our understanding of both Ottoman society and early modern political systems might need some serious revision. Around the major political dramas we've been discussing, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played roles that would have made Shakespeare jealous of their complex motivations and dramatic story arcs. Let's talk about some of the women who didn't make it into the history books as major political figures, but who were absolutely essential to understanding how this whole system actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. First, there was Sultan, who represented what happened when someone with genuine artistic talent found themselves trapped in a political institution. She was the daughter of Sultan Selim II and could have leveraged her royal blood into serious political influence. But instead, she became obsessed with architecture and urban planning. While other women were plotting succession strategies, Sultan was designing fountains, commissioning mosques, and essentially serving as the Ottoman Empire's unofficial Minister of Public Works. Her buildings still stand in Istanbul today, and they're gorgeous. But her political career was basically non-existent, because she couldn't be bothered to pay attention to palace intrigue when there were bridges that needed designing done. Then we have Sultana Safi's daughter, Sultan, who showed what happened when someone grew up in the harem system and decided that the whole thing was completely insane. Instead of trying to navigate the complex political hierarchies, essentially became the Ottoman Empire's first recorded feminist rebel. She refused to marry the men chosen for her, openly criticized the harem system in letters to her friends, and spent most of her time reading philosophy and writing what were essentially early feminist treatises. Her family considered her a major embarrassment. European ambassadors thought she was fascinating, and she died young under circumstances that were suspicious enough that several people wrote memoirs about her. Perhaps most intriguingly, there was Geverhan Sultan, who discovered that she had a talent for what we would now call venture capitalism. While other women were focused on traditional harem careers, Geverhan figured out how to use her position to become one of the Ottoman Empire's major merchants. She established trade relationships with Venetian merchants, invested in shipping ventures, and essentially created a business empire that operated out of the harem. Her success was so spectacular that male merchants started trying to get their wives invited to harem social events so they could pitch business deals to her through intermediaries. These weren't isolated incidents or individual eccentricities. They were part of a complex web of relationships and interdependencies that made the harem function as a social and economic institution, far beyond its official political role. The women I've mentioned were all connected through family relationships, business partnerships, educational networks, and social alliances that created what was essentially an alternative power structure within the Ottoman Empire. For example, Sultan's architectural projects were often financed through Geverhan Sultan's trading profits, which were secured through political connections maintained by women like Sultan, who had relationships with foreign intellectuals and diplomats. When Sultan wanted to build a new fountain complex, she would approach Geverhan Sultan for funding, who would then consult with her network of merchant contacts to determine whether the project would increase property values in ways that would benefit her other investments. The political networks were even more complex. Sultan's feminist writings were circulated through a network of educated women that extended from the Ottoman court to Venetian merchant families to Persian royal courts. Her ideas about women's education and political rights influenced other royal women across the Islamic world, creating what historians now recognize as one of the earliest international women's rights movements. The unintended consequences and connections created some truly bizarre situations. Geverhan Sultan's business success attracted the attention of European merchants who started sending their daughters to Constantinople, hoping they would be recruited into the harem system, not because they wanted their daughters to become concubines, but because they wanted access to the most sophisticated business network in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman court found itself in the strange position of having to turn away European families who were volunteering their daughters for what was technically slavery because they viewed it as a better career opportunity than anything available in their home countries. Meanwhile, the web of relationships had created what was essentially an informal intelligence network that extended across 3 continents. A merchant in Venice might know about political developments in Isfahan before the Ottoman government did, because Geverhan Sultan's trading partners were connected to networks that included Persian court women who corresponded with ex-sultans. Intellectual circle. To understand how remarkable this all was, you have to understand what daily life was actually like for ordinary women in the early 17th century. In most of Europe, women couldn't own property, conduct business, receive formal education, or participate in political discussions. Even aristocratic women were expected to focus on domestic management and religious observance, with any intellectual or artistic pursuits being considered slightly scandalous. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman harem, women were running international business empires, designing major architectural projects, and conducting diplomatic correspondence with foreign governments. The cultural gap between what was happening inside the harem and what was happening in the rest of the world was so enormous that European observers often struggled to believe their own reports. The social structures that made this possible were unique to the Ottoman system, because the harem women were technically outside the normal social hierarchy. They weren't wives or daughters in the traditional sense, but they weren't exactly servants either. They had a kind of social freedom that was unavailable to women in more conventional arrangements. They could pursue interests and careers that would have been impossible for women who were constrained by traditional family relationships and social expectations. The beliefs and attitudes that supported this system were complex and often contradictory. The Ottoman court officially maintained that women were naturally suited for domestic roles and should defer to male authority in political matters. At the same time, they were creating institutional structures that gave women unprecedented access to education, economic opportunities, and political influence. The cognitive dissonance was resolved through elaborate fictions that allowed everyone to pretend that the women weren't really exercising power. They were just advising, or managing, or facilitating. What was normal versus exceptional in this context was completely inverted compared to European standards. In the harem, it was normal for women to be literate in multiple languages, abnormal for them not to have some kind of specialized skill or area of expertise. It was expected that they would have opinions about political matters, unusual if they weren't involved in some kind of economic activity. The cultural norms that developed within the harem were so different from the surrounding society that women who left the system often had difficulty readjusting to conventional expectations. Perhaps most fascinating was the fundamental irony that the Ottoman Empire, which was officially one of the most patriarchal societies in the world, had accidentally created one of the most feminist institutions in human history. The harem system was designed to control and limit women, but it ended up educating and empowering them in ways that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 2 centuries. The contradictions were everywhere and often absurd. Women who were technically slaves wielded more real authority than most European queens. An institution designed to serve male pleasure became a center of female intellectual and artistic achievement. A system created to ensure male control over succession became the mechanism through which women gained unprecedented political influence. The most delicious irony was that the European powers who were constantly criticizing the Ottoman Empire for its treatment of women were being diplomatically outmaneuvered by those same women on a regular basis. Venetian merchants who considered themselves sophisticated found themselves being schooled in international commerce by women they assumed were just pretty decorations. Habsburg diplomats who thought they understood Oriental despotism discovered that they were actually negotiating with some of the shrewdest political minds in the Mediterranean world. Modern parallels to these contradictions are uncomfortable and illuminating. We're looking at a system where women gained extraordinary opportunities and influence precisely because they were excluded from conventional power structures. Their marginalization became their strength because it forced them to develop alternative networks and skills that turned out to be more effective than the traditional ones. The ultimate contradiction was that a system designed to prevent women from having power ended up proving that women were often better at exercising power than the men who were supposed to have it by right. The harem became a kind of unintentional laboratory for female leadership, and the results were so impressive that they forced the entire Ottoman governmental system to evolve in response. Sound familiar? We're essentially looking at a historical example of what happens when a society accidentally gives women access to education, economic resources, and political networks, while simultaneously excluding them from conventional career paths. The result was innovation, effectiveness, and a level of political sophistication that made the conventional system look primitive by comparison. Now, here's something that absolutely nobody talks about when they're fantasizing about life in an Ottoman harem: the mind-numbing complexity of the financial system that made the whole thing possible. If you thought modern corporate budgeting was complicated, try managing the economic empire that supported thousands of people in a lifestyle that would make today's tech billionaires look like they were living on food stamps. The Imperial Harem wasn't just a residence or even a governmental institution. It was essentially a massive corporation with revenue streams, investment portfolios, and operating expenses that would have impressed a modern CFO. We're talking about an organization that owned entire villages, controlled trade routes, managed manufacturing operations, and maintained what was arguably the world's first systematic approach to venture capitalism. And all of this was being run by women who were supposed to be sitting around looking pretty and occasionally producing heirs. Let's start with the basics: housing, feeding, clothing, and entertaining several thousand people requires serious money. The harem population varied over time, but at its peak, we're looking at roughly 4,000 residents, including not just the Sultan's women, but also their servants, teachers, guards, administrators, and various specialists. To put this in perspective, that's like running a small city. Except this small city had standards of living that were higher than what most European royalty enjoyed. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of just being a massive expense that drained the imperial treasury, the harem became a profit center. The women didn't just consume resources, they generated them. They developed manufacturing operations that produced some of the finest textiles, jewelry, and crafts in the empire. They established trading relationships that brought in revenue from across the known world. They created investment strategies that would have made Renaissance banking families weep with envy. The financial innovation started with necessity. The traditional Ottoman approach to funding royal households was to allocate a fixed budget from the imperial treasury and let the recipients figure out how to live within their means. But the harem women quickly discovered that this approach was both limiting and inefficient. Why accept a fixed allowance when you could create your own revenue streams and potentially become wealthier than the Sultan himself? The most successful economic venture was textile production, and this wasn't just pretty women doing embroidery in their spare time. The harem operated what was essentially a luxury goods manufacturing empire that employed thousands of people and supplied markets from London to Baghdad. They had figured out how to combine artistic design, quality control, efficient production methods, and international marketing in ways that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 2 centuries. The process started with raw materials. The harem women established direct relationships with silk producers in Bursa, cotton growers in Egypt, and gold thread manufacturers in Damascus. Instead of buying these materials through traditional intermediaries, who marked up prices at every step, they cut out the middlemen and sometimes even invested directly in the production facilities. Imagine if Amazon had been started by a group of women in a 16th century palace, and you'll get some idea of the scale and sophistication of these operations. The manufacturing process was organized with the kind of systematic efficiency that would have impressed Henry Ford. Different workshops specialized in different aspects of production: spinning, weaving, dyeing, embroidering, finishing. Quality standards were maintained through detailed specifications and regular inspections. Production schedules were coordinated to meet both domestic demand and international orders. They even developed what we would now recognize as just-in-time inventory management to minimize storage costs and reduce waste. But the really impressive part was the marketing and distribution network. The harem women had established agents in major commercial centers throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa who handled sales, customer relationships, and market intelligence. These agents weren't just selling Ottoman textiles. They were gathering information about fashion trends, consumer preferences, and competitive products that was fed back to the production teams in Constantinople. It was an early version of global market research that gave Ottoman producers significant advantages over their competitors. The financial returns were spectacular. Conservative estimates suggest that harem textile operations generated annual revenues equivalent to the tax income from several major provinces. More importantly, these were profits that accrued directly to the women involved rather than to the imperial treasury, which gave them financial independence that translated into political influence. When you can fund your own operations and still have money left over to invest in other people's projects, you're not just a political player, you're a political force. The textile success was just the beginning. The harem women discovered that having large amounts of capital gave them opportunities to become involved in what we would now call private equity and venture capital investments. They started lending money to merchants, funding trading expeditions, and taking ownership stakes in various commercial enterprises throughout the empire. Their approach to investment was surprisingly sophisticated and surprisingly modern. Instead of just lending money at fixed interest rates, they often structured deals as partnerships where they shared both risks and rewards with the entrepreneurs they were funding. They diversified their portfolios across different industries and geographic regions to minimize risk. They conducted due diligence investigations that included background checks on potential partners, market analysis of proposed ventures, and ongoing monitoring of their investment's performance. The most remarkable example was their involvement in the spice trade. European accounts from the period describe Ottoman women who had never left the palace but who could discuss the relative merits of different cinnamon suppliers in Ceylon, analyze the impact of monsoon patterns on pepper prices, and predict how political developments in the Indian Ocean would affect nutmeg availability. They weren't just passive investors. They were active participants in the global economy who understood international markets better than most. Professional merchants. Their banking operations were equally impressive. The harem women developed what was essentially a private banking system that provided financial services to merchants, government officials, and even foreign visitors to the empire. They offered currency exchange, letters of credit, and international fund transfers that were faster and more reliable than anything available through official channels. European ambassadors often found it easier to arrange financing for their missions through harem contacts than through their own government's banking systems. The investment returns were reinvested in expanding their operations, funding new ventures, and building what we would now recognize as a diversified financial portfolio. By the peak of the system, some individual harem women controlled personal wealth that exceeded the annual budgets of major European kingdoms. They weren't just economically independent. They were major economic players in their own right. The logical next step was real estate development. And here again, the harem. Women proved to be ahead of their time. They began purchasing properties throughout the empire, not just as investments, but as the foundation for integrated development projects that combined residential, commercial, and institutional uses in ways that wouldn't become common in Europe. Until the 19th century, their approach to construction was systematic and professional. They hired the best architects and engineers available, but they also participated directly in the design process. Many of the most beautiful buildings in Ottoman cities were designed through collaborative processes that combined professional expertise with the aesthetic sensibilities and practical requirements specified by their harem sponsors. The projects weren't just about creating beautiful buildings. They were about creating economic ecosystems. A typical harem-sponsored development might include residential housing for different income levels, commercial spaces for retailers and craftsmen, public facilities like baths and schools, and religious institutions like mosques and charitable foundations. The goal was to create self-sustaining communities that would generate long-term income while also providing social benefits. The financial engineering behind these projects was remarkably sophisticated. The harem women developed early versions of what we would now call real estate investment trusts, where multiple investors pooled their resources to fund large-scale developments. They created financing structures that allowed them to leverage their capital to undertake much larger projects than would have been possible with cash purchases alone. They even pioneered some early forms of municipal bonds to fund public infrastructure. Improvements thought the social impact was significant. Harem-sponsored developments often included features that were unusual for the time: affordable housing for workers, public spaces designed for community gatherings, educational facilities that served both boys and girls, and commercial spaces that were specifically designed to support small-scale entrepreneurs. These weren't just economic investments. They were early examples of what we would now call impact investing, where financial returns were balanced with social benefits. The most impressive aspect of the harem economic system was its international scope. The women had developed trading relationships that extended from northern Europe to southern Africa, from western Morocco to eastern Indonesia. They weren't just passive recipients of goods brought to them by others. They were active participants in global commerce who understood international markets and maintained direct relationships with suppliers and customers thousands of miles away. Their competitive advantages were numerous and often unexpected. Because they were women, they often had access to information and relationships that were unavailable to male merchants who were limited by traditional gender restrictions. In different societies, a harem woman could correspond directly with the wives and daughters of important merchants and officials in other countries, creating informal intelligence networks that provided valuable information about political developments, economic conditions, and commercial opportunities. Their multinational operations were coordinated through what was essentially an early version of a modern multinational corporation. They had local representatives in major commercial centers who understood regional markets and could adapt products and marketing strategies to local conditions. They had standardized accounting systems that allowed them to track performance across different operations and different countries. They had communication systems that kept information flowing between different parts of their network, despite the obvious limitations of 16th and 17th century transportation and communication technology. The scale of these operations was enormous. Contemporary European sources describe Ottoman textile exports that dominated markets from London to Lisbon, spice imports that controlled distribution throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and financial operations that influenced currency exchange RATES across multiple countries. The harem women weren't just successful in business. They were major players in the global economy who could influence international markets through their decisions about production, investment, and trade. What made all of this possible was the unique position that harem women occupied in Ottoman society. They were outside the normal legal and social restrictions that limited other women's economic activities. But they were also outside the traditional male networks that controlled most commercial operations. This forced them to develop alternative approaches that often proved superior to conventional methods. Their success created a fascinating feedback loop. Economic independence gave them political influence, which they used to create policies that supported their economic activities, which generated more wealth that could be converted into more political influence. It was exactly the kind of self-reinforcing cycle that creates lasting change in power structures. The implications for the broader Ottoman economy were significant. Harem economic activities introduced new levels of efficiency, innovation, and international connectivity that influenced how the entire empire approached commerce and development. Their success demonstrated that excluding women from economic participation wasn't just unfair. It was economically inefficient because it wasted valuable human resources and limited opportunities for innovation. The modern parallels are striking. We're looking at an early example of how economic empowerment can lead to political influence, how alternative networks can outperform traditional systems, and how diversity in leadership can drive innovation and efficiency. The harem women had figured out lessons about economic development and international commerce that contemporary development economists are still trying to perfect. Everything changed when Sultan Ibrahim came to power in 1640, and I mean changed, in the way that a perfectly organized dinner party changes when someone accidentally invites their ex-boyfriend and his new girlfriend, who happens to be their former best friend. Ibrahim was what historians politely call eccentric and what everyone else would call completely unhinged. And his ascension to the throne created a crisis that would test every assumption about how the harem system was supposed to work. The background to this change was that the careful balance of power that had developed between the Sultan and the valid Sultan system was predicated on having a Sultan who was at least minimally competent at the ceremonial aspects of ruling. Ibrahim, unfortunately, had spent most of his life locked in what was essentially a luxury prison, the traditional Ottoman practice of confining potential heirs to prevent rebellions. And isolation had not been kind to his mental health. The key factors that led to transformation were both institutional and personal. Institutionally, the harem system had become so successful at managing imperial governance that it had created a kind of dependency. The empire now needed competent female leadership to function effectively. Personally, Ibrahim's various psychological issues meant that traditional male authority was not just ineffective, but actively dangerous to the stability of the empire. Why this moment was different from previous succession crises was that the harem women had developed enough institutional power and confidence to essentially stage what amounted to a governmental intervention. Instead of trying to work around an incompetent sultan, they decided to work through him, and when that failed, they made the unprecedented decision to work against him. The crisis began almost immediately after Ibrahim's coronation. Within months, he had managed to alienate the Janissaries by demanding that they change their uniforms to colors he found more aesthetically pleasing, offend religious authorities by declaring that he wanted to convert one of the empire's most sacred mosques into a giant bathing complex, and create a diplomatic incident by sending the Habsburg ambassador a letter written entirely in what appeared to be gibberish, but was actually Ibrahim's attempt at inventing a new language. How change unfolded was both gradual and dramatic, like watching a slow-motion explosion. The harem women, led by Ibrahim's mother Qasim Sultan, initially tried to manage the situation through traditional behind-the-scenes influence. They attempted to surround Ibrahim with competent advisors, limit his access to important decision-making, and essentially create a system where he could be sultan in name while other people handled the actual governing. But Ibrahim proved to be remarkably creative in his ability to circumvent these arrangements. He developed a talent for making important decisions at random moments when his handlers weren't paying attention, and his decisions were so consistently counterproductive that the empire began to suffer real damage. The breaking point came when he decided to declare war on Venice because he had had a dream in which a talking cat told him that Venetians were stealing Ottoman fish. The resistance to change came from multiple directions and for multiple reasons. Traditional Ottoman officials were horrified by the idea of formally limiting the Sultan's authority, even when that Sultan was clearly incapable of exercising authority responsibly. Religious authorities worried about the theological implications of acknowledging that divine right could be trumped by practical necessity. The Janissaries were concerned about the precedent of allowing civilian authorities, especially female civilian authorities, to override military decisions. The champions of change were primarily the harem women themselves, but they were supported by some surprising allies. Practical-minded administrators who had seen the empire's efficiency during the previous decades of female influence realized that competent governance was more important than maintaining theoretical hierarchies. Some military commanders concluded that following orders from competent women was preferable to following orders from an incompetent man. Even some religious authorities began to argue that preserving the empire was a religious duty that took precedence over maintaining traditional gender roles. The specific steps and stages of the transformation were unprecedented in Islamic political history. First, Qasim Sultan arranged for Ibrahim to be declared mentally unfit to make major decisions, not to be deposed, but to be placed under what was essentially a regency. Then, she formalized her own role as regent, creating official documents. That gave her legal authority to act in the Sultan's name. Finally, she established a council of harem women who would collectively manage different aspects of imperial administration. The obstacles encountered were both legal and practical. There was no Islamic legal precedent for a female regency over an adult male ruler. The governmental bureaucracy had no procedures for taking orders from women. The military command structure wasn't designed to accommodate female authority. Every aspect of the system had to be reinvented in real time while managing an empire that was facing external threats and internal pressures. The breakthrough moments came when the new system started producing results that were obviously superior to what had come before. Military campaigns that had been stalled under Ibrahim's leadership suddenly became successful. Diplomatic relationships that had been damaged by his erratic behavior were repaired. The imperial treasury, which had been depleted by his expensive and pointless projects, began to recover. Even the most traditional critics had to admit that the empire was functioning better under female leadership than it had under nominal male authority. The new system that emerged was unprecedented in world history, a functioning Islamic empire under formal female leadership. Qasim Sultan wasn't hiding behind the scenes or influencing policy indirectly. She was the acknowledged head of government, making decisions, issuing orders, and taking responsibility for the consequences. How things were different was immediately apparent to anyone paying attention. Government communications became more efficient and consistent. Policy decisions showed evidence of long-term planning rather than impulsive reactions. Diplomatic relations stabilized because foreign governments could negotiate with leaders who were likely to remain in power and honor their agreements. Military operations became more strategically coherent because they were planned by people who understood both the political and economic implications of warfare. Who won and who lost in this transformation was complex. Obviously, the harem women, who had gained formal political power, were winners. But so were most ordinary Ottoman subjects who benefited from more competent governance. Military commanders who were willing to adapt to female leadership found their careers advancing rapidly. Administrators who could work effectively with the new system gained influence and responsibility. The losers were primarily those who had built their careers around traditional assumptions about gender and authority. Religious conservatives who insisted that male leadership was divinely mandated found themselves marginalized. Court officials who couldn't adapt to taking orders from women were quietly transferred to less important positions. Some janissary commanders who refused to acknowledge female authority discovered that their units were no longer receiving the best equipment or the most prestigious assignments. The new rules and norms that developed were fascinating in their specificity. Formal protocols were established for how male officials should address female superiors. New ceremonial procedures were created to maintain the fiction that the Sultan remained the ultimate authority while acknowledging that practical decisions were made by the Regency Council. Even architectural changes were made to the palace to accommodate the new reality. Meeting rooms were redesigned to allow for mixed-gender governmental sessions while maintaining appropriate Islamic modesty requirements. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically revealed the pragmatic nature of the transformation. The basic structure of Ottoman administration remained unchanged. The same governmental departments, the same provincial organization, the same legal system. But the personnel and decision-making processes were revolutionized. It was like keeping the same computer operating system, but upgrading all the software and hardware. Was this change positive or negative? The answer depends on your perspective and your priorities. From the standpoint of governmental effectiveness, it was unquestionably positive. The empire became more stable, more prosperous, and more successful in its international relationships. From the perspective of traditional Islamic political theory, it was deeply problematic. It violated fundamental assumptions about proper social order and divine authority. Different perspectives on the transformation were shaped by practical experience. People who had direct contact with the new system, administrators, military commanders, foreign diplomats, generally concluded that it was an improvement. People who experienced it secondhand or through ideological filters, traditional, religious authorities, conservative court officials, European observers who were committed to their own assumptions about Oriental despotism, were more likely to view it as a dangerous aberration. The short-term effects were dramatic and largely positive. The Ottoman Empire stabilized, prospered, and regained much of the international respect it had lost during Ibrahim's chaotic reign. But the long-term effects were more complicated. By proving that female leadership could be effective, the transformation created expectations and precedents that would influence Ottoman politics for generations. Unintended consequences included the development of what was essentially a feminist political movement within the Islamic world. Women in other Muslim societies began to point to Ottoman successes as evidence that traditional gender restrictions were culturally imposed rather than religiously mandated. This created tensions and debates that would continue for centuries. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals how much our understanding of political effectiveness has changed. Contemporary observers often focused on whether the system was proper or legitimate according to traditional standards. Modern historians are more likely to evaluate it based on whether it produced good governance and positive outcomes for the society as a whole. The consensus among current scholars is that whatever its theoretical problems, the system worked remarkably well in practice. Here's something that would blow your mind if you really understood the implications. The Ottoman harem women created and operated what was arguably the world's most sophisticated intelligence network. And they did it centuries before anyone had even imagined concepts like information warfare or strategic communications. We're talking about a system that could gather, analyze, and act on information faster and more effectively than most modern governments. And it was all coordinated by women who were supposedly locked away from the world and concerned only with palace gossip. The network wasn't planned as an intelligence operation. It evolved organically from the practical need to understand what was happening in a complex and often dangerous political environment. But what started as a survival mechanism gradually became a strategic asset that gave the Ottoman Empire significant advantages in its relationships with other powers and its management of internal affairs. The foundation of the system was correspondence. Harem women maintained extensive letter-writing relationships with women throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond. And these letters weren't just social chit-chat. They were systematic exchanges of information about political developments, economic conditions, social trends, and anything else that might be relevant to understanding how the world was changing. A typical harem woman might maintain regular correspondence with dozens of women across 3 continents, creating a communication network that was more extensive and more current than anything available to most governments. But here's what made it really sophisticated. The women had developed techniques for embedding sensitive information in apparently innocent social correspondence. A letter about fashion trends might actually be reporting on the financial condition of important merchants. A discussion of family health problems might be conveying information about the political reliability of key officials. A description of local weather patterns might be providing intelligence about military preparations or economic disruptions. The encoding wasn't crude or obvious. It was subtle enough that casual readers would see only normal social communication, but systematic enough that trained recipients could extract detailed intelligence from seemingly trivial letters. It was like having a social media network where the real content was hidden in plain sight, accessible only to people who understood the codes and conventions that governed the community. The most valuable part of the intelligence network was its connection to the merchant community, because merchants were the people who actually knew what was happening in the real world. Unlike government officials, who often reported what they thought their superiors wanted to hear, merchants had to deal with actual facts, currency fluctuations, supply disruptions, changes in demand, political instabilities that affected trade routes. Their survival depended on accurate information, which made them extremely valuable intelligence sources. The harem women had cultivated relationships with merchant families throughout the empire and beyond, often through business partnerships. That gave them legitimate reasons for extensive correspondence and personal meetings. A merchant's wife or daughter who visited the palace for social or business reasons would naturally share information about conditions in her home region, and this information was systematically collected, analyzed, and integrated into the harems. Understanding of broader trends and developments. The economic relationships created by harem business activities provided cover for intelligence gathering that would have been impossible through purely political channels. A harem woman could ask detailed questions about political conditions in Venice because she needed to assess the risks associated with her shipping investments. She could inquire about military preparations in Hungary because she wanted to evaluate the security of her overland trade routes. She could investigate the financial stability of Persian authorities because she was considering lending them money. The merchant networks also provided early warning about problems that might affect the empire. Changes in trade patterns often preceded political disruptions by months or even years. Merchants were usually the first to know about crop failures, currency problems, or military preparations that could affect regional stability. By monitoring these economic indicators through their business relationships, the harem women could often predict political developments before they became obvious to government officials. The intelligence gathered through merchant contacts was particularly valuable because it was unfiltered by political considerations. Government reports often emphasized what the writers thought would please their superiors or downplayed problems that might reflect badly on local administrators. But merchant intelligence was focused on practical concerns that affected business operations, which made it more reliable for understanding actual conditions. Perhaps even more impressive was the harem's penetration of diplomatic circles, which they achieved through a combination of social relationships, economic incentives, and sheer intellectual sophistication that often surpassed that of the professional diplomats they were monitoring. European ambassadors and their staff frequently found themselves socially engaged with harem women during their stays in Constantinople, often through carefully orchestrated cultural exchange, events that seemed purely social, but were actually systematic intelligence operations. A harem woman might invite the wife of a Venetian diplomat to view her art collection, but the real purpose was to assess Venetian attitudes toward current political developments and to plant information that would influence Venetian policy decisions. The conversations weren't crude interrogations. They were sophisticated discussions of art, literature, philosophy, and current events that allowed skilled practitioners to extract detailed information while appearing to engage in normal social interaction. The harem women had been trained from childhood in the arts of conversation and persuasion, and they used these skills to learn about the intentions, capabilities, and internal conflicts of foreign governments. The intelligence gathered was often superior to what the Ottoman government could obtain through official diplomatic channels. Foreign ambassadors were usually careful about what they said in formal meetings with Ottoman officials, but they were often more candid in social settings, with people they didn't perceive as political threats. A diplomat's wife might share information about her government's real intentions that her husband would never reveal in official negotiations. The harem women also developed techniques for influencing foreign opinion through their social contacts. They could plant stories, correct misunderstandings, or create favorable impressions that would influence how foreign governments viewed Ottoman policies and capabilities. It was soft power diplomacy conducted through personal relationships rather than official channels, and it was often more effective than traditional diplomatic methods. The network extended beyond just gathering information. It was also used to verify and cross-check intelligence obtained through other sources. Information from merchant contacts could be compared with reports from diplomatic sources to assess accuracy and identify potential deceptions. Multiple independent sources often provided different perspectives on the same events, allowing for more sophisticated analysis than would be possible from any single source. The harem intelligence network was particularly effective at monitoring religious and cultural developments that might affect political stability, partly because many of the women came from different religious and ethnic backgrounds and maintained connections to their original communities. A harem woman who had been born into a Greek Orthodox family might maintain correspondence with relatives and friends in Greek communities throughout the empire, providing insights into Orthodox attitudes toward Ottoman rule and early warning about potential unrest. A woman from a Persian background might have contacts among Shia communities that could provide intelligence about Persian political activities or religious movements that might challenge Ottoman authority. This cultural diversity was a significant intelligence asset because it provided the Ottoman government with insights into the perspectives and concerns of different ethnic and religious communities within the empire. Traditional Ottoman administration relied heavily on local officials who were often members of the communities they governed. But these officials had their own political interests that might conflict with providing accurate intelligence to the central government. The harem network could bypass these potential conflicts of interest because the women involved weren't seeking advancement within local political hierarchies. They were already part of the central government apparatus, which meant they could gather information without the same concerns about local political consequences that might influence other sources. The religious intelligence was particularly valuable for understanding the activities of various mystical orders and religious movements that operated throughout the empire. These groups often had their own networks that crossed political boundaries and could either support or challenge Ottoman authority depending on circumstances. By monitoring their activities and understanding their concerns, the harem women could often predict and prevent problems before they escalated into serious threats. The cultural intelligence also provided insights into social trends and popular attitudes that were essential for effective governance. Changes in fashion, entertainment, religious practice, or social behavior often reflected deeper cultural shifts that could have political implications. By monitoring these trends through their extensive social networks, the harem women could advise on policies that would be consistent with popular sentiment and avoid actions that might provoke unnecessary resistance. The most sensitive aspect of the harem intelligence network was its ability to gather military and strategic information, which they accomplished through a combination of direct observation, social relationships, and systematic analysis of publicly available information. The palace location gave harem women direct access to information about military preparations, troop movements, and strategic planning. They could observe which officials were meeting with whom, which messengers were arriving, from which regions, and which military commanders were being summoned for consultations. This information, combined with their understanding of palace politics and their knowledge of broader political developments, allowed them to piece together remarkably accurate assessments of Ottoman military intentions and capabilities. Their social relationships with the families of military commanders provided additional sources of information about military morale, logistical preparations, and strategic concerns. The wives and daughters of military leaders often knew about deployment plans, supply problems, or internal conflicts that might affect military effectiveness. This information was shared through the same social networks that carried other types of intelligence, creating a comprehensive picture of Ottoman military capabilities and intentions. The network was also valuable for gathering intelligence about foreign military activities. Merchants who traveled international trade routes could provide information about troop movements, fortification construction, or unusual military preparations in other countries. Diplomatic contacts could share insights into foreign military capabilities and strategic planning. Religious contacts could report on the activities of military orders or militant groups that might affect regional security. The analysis of this military intelligence was often superior to what was available through official military channels because it combined information from multiple sources with sophisticated understanding of political and economic factors that might influence military decisions. The harem women understood that military actions were usually driven by political and economic considerations rather than purely strategic ones, and they could often predict military developments by analyzing these underlying factors. The strategic intelligence was particularly valuable for understanding the long-term trends and developments that might affect the empire's security and prosperity. By monitoring technological developments, economic changes, political shifts, and social trends across multiple countries and regions, the harem network could identify emerging threats and opportunities that might not be apparent to officials who were focused on immediate concerns. What made the harem intelligence network truly sophisticated was not just its ability to gather information, but its systematic approach to analyzing that information and converting it into actionable intelligence that could influence policy decisions. The women had developed techniques for evaluating source reliability, cross-checking information from multiple sources, and identifying patterns and trends that might not be apparent from individual reports. They maintained what were essentially databases of information about key individuals, important events, and significant developments, allowing them to track changes over time and identify emerging trends. the analysis wasn't conducted by individual women working in isolation. It was a collaborative process that brought together different perspectives and areas of expertise. A woman with extensive merchant contacts might provide economic analysis, while someone with diplomatic connections could offer political insights, and someone with religious contacts could assess cultural and social factors. The combination of different types of expertise often produced more sophisticated analysis than would be possible from any single perspective. The intelligence was used to influence both short-term tactical decisions and long-term strategic planning. In the short term, it might affect decisions about diplomatic negotiations, military deployments, or economic policies. In the long term, it might influence assessments of emerging threats, potential opportunities, or structural changes that would require fundamental policy adjustments. The most impressive aspect of the system was its integration with decision-making processes. The intelligence wasn't just collected and analyzed. It was systematically incorporated into policy, discussions, and strategic planning. The harem women who controlled the intelligence network were also major participants in imperial governance, which meant that high-quality intelligence was directly available to decision-makers, rather than being filtered through multiple bureaucratic layers. The modern parallels are striking and somewhat uncomfortable. We're looking at an early example of how informal networks can sometimes provide superior intelligence to official government agencies, how social relationships can be systematically leveraged for strategic purposes, and how excluded groups can develop alternative capabilities that prove superior to mainstream approaches. The harem intelligence network was essentially a prototype for modern information warfare, conducted by women who were supposed to be powerless and isolated from political affairs. The ultimate lesson is that information is power, but only if you know how to collect it, analyze it, and act on it effectively. The harem women had figured out all three aspects of this equation centuries before most governments understood that intelligence was a systematic discipline rather than just a collection of random reports. In the years and decades that followed Ibrahim's effective removal from power, the Ottoman Empire discovered that having accidentally created the world's first functioning female-led Islamic government was just the beginning of their problems. Like a software company that releases a revolutionary product and then has to figure out how to make it work at scale, the Ottomans found themselves dealing with the complex implications of their own success. The new challenges were both practical and philosophical. Practically, they had to figure out how to integrate female leadership into a governmental system that had been designed around male authority. Every legal document, every ceremonial protocol, every administrative procedure had to be revised or reinterpreted. It was like trying to renovate a house while you're living in it, except the house was a government, and the renovation involved changing fundamental assumptions about how society was supposed to work. Philosophically, they had to reconcile Islamic legal theory with political reality. Traditional Islamic jurisprudence didn't provide much guidance for situations where female leadership was clearly more effective than male leadership, but acknowledging this reality explicitly would have undermined centuries of legal and theological precedent. The solution was typically Ottoman. They developed an elaborate system of legal fictions that allowed everyone to pretend that things were still working according to traditional principles, while actually operating according to entirely different rules. The evolution of the situation over time was both predictable and surprising. Predictably, the system became more institutionalized as the initial crisis-driven innovations were formalized into regular procedures. Less predictably, the success of female leadership in the central government began to influence provincial administration, military organization, and even religious institutions in ways that nobody had anticipated. Second-generation effects included the development of what historians now call the Ottoman Administrative Revolution, a comprehensive modernization of governmental procedures that was largely designed and implemented by women who had been trained in the harem system. These weren't just minor administrative improvements. They were fundamental changes in how a large empire could be governed effectively in an increasingly complex world. The new important figures and institutions that emerged during this period were remarkable for their diversity and their competence. Sultan, who became regent when her son Mehmed IV ascended to the throne as a child, proved to be even more politically sophisticated than her predecessors. She had learned from observing the successes and failures of earlier harem leaders, and she brought a level of systematic thinking to imperial governance that was unprecedented. Unlike earlier harem women who had gained power through personal relationships or crisis management, Sultan approached governance like a modern executive. She established formal advisory councils, created systematic procedures for policy development, and implemented what were essentially management information systems to track the effectiveness of different governmental programs. Her innovations were so successful that they were copied by other governments and became standard practice in Ottoman administration for centuries. But perhaps more interesting were the male officials who emerged during this period and who had been specifically trained to work effectively in the new system. These weren't traditional Ottoman administrators who had been forced to adapt. They were a new generation of officials who had been educated from the beginning to view competent female leadership as normal and desirable. They developed skills in collaborative decision-making, systematic analysis, and long-term planning that made the Ottoman bureaucracy remarkably effective compared to its European counterparts. Their roles differed dramatically from earlier players in Ottoman politics. Instead of competing for personal access to the Sultan or trying to advance their careers through traditional patronage networks, these new administrators focused on institutional effectiveness and systematic problem-solving. They were more like modern civil servants than like classical courtiers. How they differed from earlier players was evident in their approach to policy development. Earlier Ottoman governance had been characterized by personal relationships, informal networks, and ad hoc solutions to immediate problems. The new system emphasized institutional knowledge, systematic analysis, and long-term strategic planning. It was the difference between running a government like a medieval court and running it like a modern corporation. Their contributions and disruptions were transformative. The new administrative systems they developed allowed the Ottoman Empire to manage increasing complexity while maintaining effectiveness. But their success also disrupted traditional power relationships and created new tensions between different parts of the governmental system. But some problems persisted, and some of them actually got worse as the system evolved. The continuing challenges included the fundamental contradiction between the empire's official ideology and its actual governmental practices. Officially, the Ottoman Empire remained committed to traditional Islamic principles of male authority and hierarchical social organization. In practice, it was increasingly run by women who made decisions based on pragmatic considerations rather than ideological commitments. What didn't get resolved was the question of legitimacy. The female-led system was clearly more effective than what had come before, but it was also clearly inconsistent with traditional Islamic political theory. This created ongoing tensions with religious authorities, conservative political factions, and other Muslim societies that viewed Ottoman innovations with suspicion. New versions of old problems emerged as the system became more institutionalized. The original harem system had been designed to prevent any individual woman from gaining too much power. But the new governmental arrangements concentrated so much authority in the hands of the valid Sultan and her allies that they created new opportunities for abuse and corruption. Some of the later harem leaders became so powerful that they effectively ruled the empire as absolute monarchs. which created all the problems associated with autocratic governance. The cyclical patterns that emerged were fascinating and depressing. Periods of effective female leadership alternated with periods when incompetent or corrupt women gained power and used it badly. The system had solved the problem of incompetent male leadership, but it hadn't eliminated the fundamental problem of incompetent leadership in general. Why certain issues proved intractable was partly due to the fundamental contradictions built into the system. You can't simultaneously maintain the traditional hierarchies are divinely ordained, and that practical effectiveness is more important than theoretical correctness. Eventually, these contradictions create problems that can't be resolved through administrative innovation or political maneuvering. The most persistent problem was succession. The Ottoman system had never developed effective mechanisms for ensuring smooth transitions of power, and the addition of powerful female leadership made succession even more complicated. When a strong, valid sultan died or lost influence, the resulting power struggles could paralyze the government for months or even years. Compared to earlier periods of Ottoman history, the era of formalized female leadership represented both the empire's greatest administrative achievements and the beginning of its most serious structural problems. The governmental innovations developed during this period allowed the Ottomans to maintain their position as a major power long after other traditional empires had begun to decline. But the contradictions between ideology and practice created instabilities that would eventually contribute to the empire's downfall. Compared to other places and other times, the Ottoman system during this period was unique in world history. No other major empire had ever successfully institutionalized female political leadership to this extent. European governments weren't even close to developing this kind of administrative sophistication. The Chinese imperial system was more bureaucratically advanced, but it was also more rigid and less adaptable to changing circumstances. What was unique about the Ottoman experiment was its combination of pragmatic flexibility with institutional innovation. The harem women hadn't just seized power. They had redesigned governmental systems to make power more effective. They had created new forms of political organization that were more responsive to complex challenges than traditional autocratic or aristocratic systems. What was universal was the human tendency to resist change, even when change is obviously beneficial. The opposition to female leadership in the Ottoman Empire was similar to resistance movements throughout history that have prioritized traditional authority over effective governance. The psychological and social dynamics were recognizable across different cultures and time periods. The lessons that could be learned were both encouraging and sobering. The encouraging lesson was that societies could adapt to dramatically changing circumstances and develop new forms of organization that were superior to what had come before. The sobering lesson was that even successful innovations could create new problems, and that institutional change was always more difficult and more complicated than it initially appeared. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the tendency for marginalized groups to develop alternative competencies that eventually proved superior to mainstream approaches. Similar dynamics appeared in other contexts where women, ethnic minorities, or other excluded groups were forced to develop innovative solutions to problems that traditional authorities couldn't solve effectively. The most important comparative insight was that the Ottoman experience demonstrated the possibility of major political innovation within traditional societies. It showed that dramatic change didn't require revolution or external conquest. It could emerge from the creative adaptation of existing institutions to new circumstances. But it also showed that innovation without ideological coherence created long-term instabilities that could eventually undermine even the most successful practical arrangements. By the early 18th century, signs pointed to the end of the era of effective female leadership in the Ottoman Empire. Though, like most historical endings, it was more of a slow fade than a dramatic collapse. The warning signs were everywhere if you knew how to read them, but they were the kind of subtle institutional decay that's only obvious in retrospect. Like noticing that your favorite restaurant has started using cheaper ingredients and hiring less experienced staff, but you don't realize how much things have changed until you compare it to what it used to be. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the inherent difficulty of recognizing the end of your own era while you're living through it. The harem women who had built the system could see that the quality of new recruits was declining, that the educational standards were being relaxed, and that the political sophistication that had characterized earlier generations was being replaced by a focus on personal luxury and court intrigue. But they interpreted these as temporary problems that could be solved through better management rather than symptoms of fundamental structural change. What they missed was that the very success of the system had eliminated the conditions that had made it possible in the first place. The original harem leaders had gained power because they were more competent than the available alternatives. But as the system became institutionalized, competence became less important than political connections, family relationships, and ability to navigate increasingly complex bureaucratic procedures. The resistance to inevitable change came from multiple directions, and much of it was unconscious rather than deliberate. The harem women themselves resisted acknowledging that their system was declining because admitting failure would have undermined their own authority and legitimacy. The governmental bureaucracy resisted change because the existing system provided them with job security and clear advancement paths. Even critics of the system resisted change because they had built their careers around opposing it, and they weren't sure what they would oppose if it disappeared. The most tragic resistance came from the women who tried to maintain the old standards of excellence in an environment that no longer rewarded excellence. They continued to educate themselves, develop political skills, and attempt to provide competent leadership. But they found themselves increasingly marginalized by colleagues who had learned that personal advancement was more important than institutional effectiveness. The external pressures that were building were both military and economic. European powers were developing new forms of military organization and technology that made traditional Ottoman advantages obsolete. The economic system that had supported the empire's expansion was being undermined by changes in global trade, patterns that favored different kinds of commercial organization. These weren't problems that could be solved through better administration or more sophisticated political maneuvering. They required fundamental restructuring of the entire imperial system. How the era ended was less like a dramatic finale and more like watching a beautiful garden slowly become overgrown and neglected. There was no single moment when female leadership in the Ottoman Empire officially ended. No dramatic confrontation or decisive battle. Instead, there was a gradual process by which the positions remained the same, but the people filling them became less capable, less interested in governance, and more focused on personal status and luxury. The specific events that marked the transition were often absurd rather than tragic. Take the case of Rabia Julnik Sultan, who became valid Sultan in 1695, and who represented everything that had gone wrong with the system. Instead of focusing on governmental administration, she became obsessed with palace renovations, spending enormous sums on interior decorating projects, while the empire faced serious military and economic challenges. Her most famous achievement was commissioning a series of rooms decorated entirely with precious stones arranged in patterns that spelled out poetry about her own beauty and wisdom. The final major players in the drama were often people who would have been minor figures in earlier eras. Julnik Sultan gained power not because of her political skills or administrative competence, but because she was the mother of Sultan Ahmed III, and because no one else was particularly interested in challenging her for the position. Her reign represented the complete transformation of the valid sultan role from active governmental leadership to symbolic court position. The last attempts to preserve the old system were undertaken by women who understood what was being lost, but lacked the political power to prevent it. Some tried to maintain educational standards and recruit capable new women into the harem. Others attempted to revive the political networks and diplomatic relationships that had made earlier female leaders so effective. But these efforts were undermined by the fundamental change in the empire's circumstances and the lack of institutional support for maintaining the old standards. The dramatic final moments were actually quite undramatic. The last effectively powerful valid sultan simply died of natural causes, and her successors were content to enjoy the ceremonial aspects of their positions without bothering with the actual work of governance. The governmental functions that had been performed by harem women were gradually transferred to male officials, who often had less experience and training, but who fit better with the empire's increasingly traditional approach to political organization. The gradual decline was evident in everything from the quality of diplomatic correspondence to the effectiveness of military coordination to the sophistication of economic policy. Decisions that had once been made quickly and effectively through informal harem networks now required lengthy bureaucratic processes that often produced inferior results. The empire continued to function, but it functioned less well than it had during the peak years of female leadership. The analysis of causes reveals a complex interaction of internal problems and external pressures that made the continuation of effective female leadership increasingly difficult. The internal problems were partly the result of success. The system had become so institutionalized that it attracted people who were interested in status and privilege rather than responsibility and effectiveness. The external pressures were even more significant. The European military revolution was making traditional Ottoman military advantages obsolete, which meant that the empire needed different kinds of leadership skills than those that had been developed in the harem system. The economic changes associated with early capitalism were creating new forms of wealth and power that were difficult to manage through traditional governmental structures, regardless of who was in charge. The role of individuals versus historical forces is debated by historians, but the evidence suggests that individual failures accelerated trends that were probably inevitable given the changing international context. Better leadership might have managed the transition more effectively, but it probably couldn't have prevented the fundamental transformation of the Ottoman system. What could have been done differently is an interesting counterfactual question. The most obvious alternative would have been to formally institutionalize female leadership, rather than maintain it through informal networks and legal fictions. If the Ottomans had created official governmental positions for women and developed formal succession procedures for female leaders, the system might have been more durable and adaptable to changing circumstances than another possibility would have been to expand the harem educational system to train both men and women for governmental service, creating a more integrated approach to political leadership that could have drawn on the best talents regardless of gender. This might have avoided some of the contradictions and tensions that ultimately undermined the system. The question of inevitability versus contingency is complex. Some of the problems were probably inevitable given the broader historical trends toward more bureaucratic and systematic forms of government organization. But the specific way the system declined, through gradual degradation rather than deliberate reform, was probably avoidable with better leadership and more strategic thinking about long-term institutional development. The legacy of the Ottoman harem system shaped later developments in ways that most people don't realize, partly because the influence was often indirect, and partly because acknowledging it would have required admitting that some very traditional societies had accidentally stumbled onto some very progressive ideas centuries before progressive became fashionable. The specific influences on later Islamic political development were both obvious and subtle. Obviously, the Ottoman experiment proved that effective female leadership was possible within Islamic societies, which provided ammunition for later feminist movements throughout the Muslim world. Less obviously, the administrative innovations developed by harem women became standard practice in Ottoman governance and were eventually copied by other governments, though usually without acknowledging their female origins. How later generations viewed the harem period reveals the complex relationship between historical memory and political ideology. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the Ottoman Empire was in decline and most Muslim societies were dealing with European colonialism, the harem system was generally viewed as an embarrassing example of how traditional Islamic societies had deviated from proper religious principles. The fact that it had been effective was less important than the fact that it didn't fit with either traditional Islamic ideology or modern European ideas about proper governance. But by the late 20th century, as feminist movements gained strength throughout the Islamic world, the harem system began to be reinterpreted as an early example of successful female empowerment. This created some awkward cognitive dissonance because celebrating the harem meant celebrating an institution that was also associated with sexual slavery and patriarchal control. But historical memory has never been particularly concerned with logical consistency. The myths versus realities that developed around the harem system were predictably dramatic and usually wrong. The most persistent myth was the romantic fantasy of beautiful women lounging around in silk pajamas, waiting to seduce the Sultan, an image that completely ignored the political, economic, and administrative functions that had made the system historically significant. The reality of highly educated women managing complex governmental institutions was less visually appealing than the fantasy. So it was the fantasy that survived in popular culture. Another persistent myth was that the harem system represented the oppression of women by patriarchal Islamic society. While this wasn't entirely wrong, the women were technically slaves and couldn't leave freely. It missed the more complex reality that the system had also provided women with opportunities for education, political influence, and economic power that were unavailable anywhere else in the world at that time. Why the harem period remained important to some and forgotten by others depended largely on political considerations. Feminist historians found it useful as evidence that female leadership had historical precedent in Islamic societies. Traditional religious authorities preferred to forget about it because it complicated their arguments about divinely ordained gender roles. Secular nationalists in former Ottoman territories sometimes celebrated it as evidence of their society's progressive heritage, but sometimes ignored it because it was associated with imperial domination. Today, we can see echoes of the Ottoman harem system in various modern examples of how marginalized groups develop alternative competencies that eventually prove superior to mainstream approaches. The most obvious parallel is in the corporate world, where women and minorities who were excluded from traditional career paths often developed skills in collaboration, systematic analysis, and relationship management that turned out to be more effective than traditional command and control approaches. The specific parallels are sometimes startling. Just as harem women developed informal networks that were more effective than formal governmental structures, modern women in business and politics often create alternative communication and decision-making systems that accomplish more than traditional hierarchical organizations. The same skills that made Sultan effective at managing imperial administration, attention to detail, long-term thinking, ability to coordinate multiple stakeholders with conflicting interests, are exactly the skills that modern management theorists identify as essential for complex organizational leadership. What hasn't changed about human nature is the tendency for people in power to resist acknowledging the competence of people they consider naturally inferior, even when that competence is demonstrated repeatedly and definitively. The European ambassadors, who were consistently outmaneuvered by Ottoman harem women, but continued to assume that women were naturally unsuited for political leadership, were displaying the same psychological patterns we see in modern organizations, where female executives have to prove their competence repeatedly, while their male colleagues are assumed to be competent until proven otherwise. Similar patterns, in different contexts, appear throughout modern history. The hidden figures phenomenon, highly competent women doing essential work while receiving little recognition or credit, is essentially the same dynamic that characterized the harem system. The difference is that modern hidden figures usually remain hidden, while the Ottoman system occasionally allowed competent women to gain formal recognition and authority. The lessons for contemporary issues are both encouraging and sobering. The encouraging lesson is that societies can develop innovative solutions to complex problems when they're willing to abandon traditional assumptions about who is qualified to solve those problems. The sobering lesson is that even successful innovations can be undermined by ideological resistance and institutional inertia. The most relevant modern parallel might be the ongoing debate about diversity and inclusion in leadership positions. The Ottoman experience suggests that organizations that are willing to draw on talent, regardless of traditional demographic categories, will often outperform organizations that limit themselves to conventional leadership profiles. But it also suggests that maintaining diverse leadership requires constant effort and institutional support, because there are always pressures to revert to traditional patterns. Another important parallel is in the area of informal versus formal authority. Just as harem women often wielded more real influence than male officials with higher formal status, modern organizations often function through informal networks and relationships that are more important than official organizational charts. Understanding these informal power structures is essential for anyone trying to accomplish anything in complex institutions. Even now, the Ottoman harem system influences several modern areas in ways that are often unrecognized, but nonetheless significant. In academic study, the harem period has become a crucial case study for historians, political scientists, and gender studies scholars who are trying to understand how societies can innovate around traditional limitations. The extensive documentation of harem administration provides one of the best historical examples of effective female political leadership, which makes it valuable for scholars studying leadership styles, organizational management, and institutional change. In popular culture, the harem continues to fascinate people, though usually for the wrong reasons. The romantic and exotic imagery associated with the harem has influenced everything from fashion to interior design to fantasy literature. But there's also a growing recognition of the historical reality behind the fantasy, which has influenced more serious artistic and literary works that explore themes of female empowerment, political innovation, and cultural adaptation. In political discourse, the harem example is sometimes cited by advocates for gender equality in Muslim societies who argue that female leadership is compatible with Islamic principles and has historical precedent. This is a complex and sometimes controversial argument because it requires distinguishing between the exploitative aspects of the harem system and its innovative aspects. But it has become an important part of contemporary debates about women's rights in Islamic context. In social movements, the harem example has influenced feminist organizing in several ways. The emphasis on building alternative networks and developing practical competencies rather than just demanding formal equality reflects strategies that were pioneered by harem women centuries ago. The recognition that change often comes through demonstrating superior effectiveness rather than through ideological arguments is another lesson that modern activists have drawn from the Ottoman Experience. Why people still care about the Ottoman harem is complicated, but it generally comes down to the fact that it represents a unique historical example of successful institutional innovation around gender roles. For people who are interested in social change, it provides evidence that dramatic transformation is possible, even within apparently rigid traditional systems. For people who are interested in leadership and management, it provides examples of effective strategies for managing complex organizations. For people who are interested in Islamic history and culture, it provides a more nuanced understanding of how traditional societies actually functioned compared to how they were supposed to function according to official ideology. The continuing relevance of the harem system is that it demonstrates the gap between theoretical principles and practical effectiveness that exists in all societies and all historical periods. Every culture has official rules about how things are supposed to work and unofficial realities about how things actually work. And the most successful societies are usually those that are flexible enough to adapt their official rules when the unofficial realities prove more effective. The ultimate lesson of the Ottoman harem may be that institutional innovation often comes from unexpected sources and takes unexpected forms, but that maintaining innovation requires constant attention to both practical effectiveness and ideological coherence. The harem women succeeded because they were better at governing than their male counterparts, but their success was ultimately undermined because their society never developed a coherent ideology that could justify and sustain female political leadership over the long term. Looking back across the nearly 2 centuries we've explored together, from Roxelana's revolutionary marriage to the gradual decline of the Sultanate of women, we've seen some truly remarkable patterns emerge that challenge pretty much everything most people think they know about historical gender roles, political innovation, and institutional change. The key patterns that defined this entire period were surprisingly consistent. First, there was the repeated discovery that women who had been excluded from traditional power structures often developed alternative competencies that proved superior to conventional approaches. Second, there was the ongoing tension between practical effectiveness and ideological legitimacy that created both opportunities for innovation and sources of long-term instability. Third, there was the demonstration that institutional change could happen gradually and organically within traditional systems, but that sustaining change required constant adaptation and renewal. The most surprising discoveries were probably the sheer scale and sophistication of female political leadership in a society that officially subordinated women to male authority. When you dig into the actual documents, the diplomatic correspondence, the administrative records, the financial accounts, what you find is evidence of governmental competence that rivaled or exceeded anything available in Europe at the same time. The gap between the official ideology and the practical reality was so enormous that it's almost funny, except that it reveals something important about how all societies actually function. The most important takeaways center around the recognition that historical change is usually more complex and more contradictory than our simplified narratives suggest. The Ottoman harem wasn't a story of female oppression or female liberation. It was both simultaneously, an understanding that paradox is essential for understanding how social change actually happens in the real world. How our understanding has evolved throughout. This exploration reflects the broader challenge of trying to make sense of historical examples that don't fit neatly into contemporary categories. The harem system was neither feminist nor anti-feminist in modern terms. It was a pragmatic adaptation to specific historical circumstances that happened to produce some outcomes that we now consider progressive, and some that we consider regressive. The biggest revelation is probably that some of the most significant political innovations in history have emerged from the margins of official society, developed by people who were excluded from conventional power structures and who therefore had to find alternative ways to achieve their goals. This suggests that contemporary societies might be missing opportunities for innovation by maintaining traditional limitations on who is allowed to participate in leadership and decision-making. Here's one final story that encapsulates everything we've been discussing. In 1656, there was a minor diplomatic crisis between the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Venice over fishing rights in the Adriatic Sea. It was exactly the kind of small, technical issue that could easily escalate into a major conflict if handled badly. But it was also boring enough that most high-ranking officials didn't want to waste time on it. The problem was assigned to Turhan Sultan, who was serving as regent for her young son. Instead of approaching it as a traditional territorial dispute, she treated it as a business problem. She arranged for detailed studies of fish migration patterns, seasonal variations in catch sizes, and the economic impact of different fishing boundaries on both Ottoman and Venetian communities. She then proposed a solution that rotated fishing rights seasonally based on the actual behavior of the fish rather than arbitrary political boundaries. The Venetian ambassador was initially skeptical about negotiating with a woman, but he was also a practical man who recognized good ideas when he saw them. The agreement they worked out became a model for later fishing rights treaties throughout the Mediterranean, and it remained in effect for over a century because it was based on practical considerations rather than political posturing. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes is that it shows how the harem system at its best combines several elements that are still relevant today. The willingness to approach problems from fresh perspectives, the emphasis on systematic analysis over ideological assumptions, the focus on practical solutions rather than symbolic victories, and the recognition that good governance requires attention to technical details that more traditional leaders often ignored. What it reveals about the entire harem phenomenon is that the most successful innovations weren't the dramatic political coups or the romantic personal stories, but the quiet administrative improvements that made the empire function more effectively day by day. The real revolution wasn't that women gained power. It was that they used that power differently and often better than their male predecessors and successors. How it connects to everything we've discussed is that it demonstrates the gap between perception and reality that characterize the entire system. From the outside, this looked like a minor diplomatic agreement negotiated by an Ottoman regent. But what it actually represented was a fundamentally different approach to governance that emphasized practical problem-solving over traditional authority, systematic analysis over intuitive decision-making, and collaborative solutions over zero-sum competition. The memorable final image is of Tar Sultan sitting in her private study, surrounded by maps and charts and correspondence from fishermen and merchants working late into the night to develop a solution to a problem that most political leaders would have either ignored or tried to solve through intimidation. It's not a romantic or exotic image, but it's a more accurate representation of what the harem system actually accomplished at its best. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through one of history's most fascinating and misunderstood institutions, it's worth reflecting on what the Ottoman harem experience can teach us about the possibilities and limitations of social change. The women we've met tonight, from Roxelana to Kaiksem Sultan to Turhan Sultan, weren't trying to advance some grand theory of gender equality or political revolution. They were simply trying to solve the practical problems they encountered as effectively as possible. And they discovered that effectiveness often required abandoning traditional assumptions about who was qualified to do what. Their legacy isn't just in the specific policies they implemented or the particular crises they resolved, but in the demonstration that institutional innovation can emerge from unexpected sources and take unexpected forms. They proved that societies can adapt to changing circumstances and develop new approaches to governance that are superior to what came before. But they also showed that sustaining innovation requires ongoing commitment and adaptation. Perhaps, most importantly, they demonstrated that the gap between official ideology and practical reality exists in all societies and all historical periods, and that the most successful societies are usually those that are flexible enough to bridge that gap creatively when circumstances require it. So as you settle in for the night, maybe take a moment to consider what assumptions about natural limitations and traditional roles might be preventing your own society from developing more effective approaches to the challenges you're facing. The Ottoman harem women figured out how to solve some pretty complex problems by ignoring conventional wisdom about what was possible and focusing instead on what was necessary. And maybe that's not such a bad approach for any of us to consider, regardless of what century we happen to be living in. The world has always been more complicated and more full of possibilities than our official stories suggest. And recognizing the complexity might be the first step toward finding better solutions to whatever problems we're currently struggling with. Thanks for joining me on this exploration tonight. Sweet dreams, and remember, history is always more interesting and more relevant than it first appears.